Okay, so we start with the definition, of course, for all, as in all mathematical things. So a group is a pair. It's a set G along with an operation star. The star is an operation from G cross G to G. Now, this is what you mean when you say star is a binary operation. Of course, the first thing that you want to know about this, first of all, when we use language, we often say the group G, okay, which of course just means that we are referring to the group. So what we are really doing right now is we are actually abbreviating the language. We should say the group is a pair which is the set G and the composition star, but we often say just the group G, and we know that there is some star somewhere in the background which we take to be sort of understood. Now, of course, this alone will not define a group. You need some properties, and the properties A, closure. This really is redundant, because the moment you say star is a map from G cross G to G, you actually mean that for all G1, G2 belonging to capital G, G1 star G2 belongs to capital G, right? So closure is automatic the moment you say star is a map from G cross G to G. So if you are reading a really good mathematical book on group theory, you will often see closure not even mentioned as a property. The reason why we mention closure as a property is that very often when we want to check that something is a group, we are not so sure that the operation that we have talked about is really a binary operation, and we need to check that. So closure essentially is a check that the operation we are talking about is really a map from G cross G to G. Then we have associativity. Which simply goes this way. This again is for all G1, G2, G3 belonging to capital G. G1 star, G2 star, G3 is the same as G1 star, G2 star, G3. Which means it does not really matter which way you put your brackets. And I'm sure you're all grown up, so I don't need to repeat the thing that when in language you can say add 1, 2, and 3, but not subtract 1, 2, and 3. And that, of course, is what associativity really means. You can say multiply G1, G2, G3. Although multiply is really not the word you should use in group theory, but we often use the language multiply. And then there exists an identity. So exists an E, identity E belonging to the group G, such that for all G belonging to capital G, G star E is E star G is G and D. For all G belonging to capital G exists G inverse belonging to capital G, such that G star G inverse is G inverse G star G, and that's E. Right. So these are the 4 basic properties which define a group. Now these properties are not minimal. So if you go by the mathematical school which says you need to define things with the least number of assumptions as needed, or as you must, and you should not go in for more, then you have a bit of a problem. That is, then you can actually see that there are redundant definitions here. For example, you don't really need to define the identity as something which works both on the left and on the right, and the inverse as something which works both on the left and on the right. This is homework for those of you who have not done this before. you should be able to prove that if you defined the rest, that is closure, associativity, and then said, okay, there's a left identity, that is E star G is G, and a right inverse for every G, that is G star G inverse is E, then that alone is enough to actually imply the existence of the right identity and the left inverse. So you don't really have to say left identity, left inverse, right inverse. You just say left identity, right inverse, that will work. Okay. That is something which you should really be able to prove rather easily. So that can be an exercise. If you have not done this before, check that that's enough. You should also check whether left identity, left inverse works, or right identity, right inverse works. Okay. Alone, that I mean. Now there are other more complicated ways of specifying the definition in which you can actually go to, say, even less number of defining properties. But frankly, this set that I've written down is sort of not overtly redundant, but yet has enough information and is useful enough for further purposes. So the history of group theory is a very rich and complicated one, and which some of you should really take a look at, simply to realize that these things did not fall from the sky. They were arrived at after a lot of round steps, lots of additional redundant definitions, and so on. So finally, this is the current definition of the group that we're going to use. Okay. Now, very often so one thing that we all know, but we should stress, in general, G1 star G2 is not equal to G2 star G1. But if for all G1, G2 belonging to G, this thing works, commutative law works, then we say that the group is abelian. So abelian group is simply a group in which all elements commute with each other. So after this, we should come to a few examples of groups. Now, and you have all seen plenty of examples of groups in the last semester as well. So maybe we will skip that for the time being. We will come back to, of course, examples, because examples are what we will deal with most of the time. Okay. So, but let's at least talk about one important example, which we will always need to talk about. This is and its cousin GL and C. So general linear group in n dimensions, real group in n dimensions, or complex group in n dimensions. So under multiplication, of course, this means matrix multiplication. That is forms of, this of course is not a group, by the way. N by n real invertible matrices. And I'm sure all of you know how the proof goes, that this is a group. How do you prove that? You have to go through all the defining properties, check that they all hold, and so on. But one very important new definition is this. What exactly is a subgroup? given a group G star a subset along with so this means the composition star restricted to H, that is to any two elements of H are of course elements of G. So you can of course talk about combining elements of H alone using the same rule is a subgroup. Of course, if H comma star H subgroup of G of course is a group. Right? Now this is very important, that just because it's a subset, it does not imply that it's going to be a subgroup, right? Because you still have to check closure, that is star comma, the star restricted to H is a binary operation. To multiply two elements or compose two elements of H using this rule, that you do get an element of H, that's something you need to check. Then you need to check whether it's, you don't need to check whether it's associative. That's a relief, because associativity checks are usually difficult. Why you don't need to check its associative is simply because it inherits the associativity property from the associativity in the entire group. So that much you don't have to check. You have to check whether the identity is in the subset. You also have to check whether the inverse of every element in this subset is also in the subset. So that's quite a lot of things to check. But there's this nice theorem that if H is a subset of G and for all H1, H2 belonging to H, if H1, H2 inverse belongs to H, then H is a subgroup. I'm of course lapsing into the standard, okay, I shouldn't really call it a mistake, but standard laziness of notation. And I'm starting to take star for granted. And although strictly speaking, from a mathematical point of view, the composition that you're using on H is not exactly the same as the composition you were using on G, but only its restriction. We will just take that for granted and we will not say star all the time. And we have also dropped the star from in between H1 and H2 inverse. So, question, all of you remember that this is a theorem, right? Yes or no? I need you to unmute yourself and tell me.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you know, also remember its proof, hopefully. So the proof is trivial. You just have to check that if this works, then all the four group axioms or group defining properties also hold. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, when I ask such a question, of course, it means if it's not okay with you, please let me know. If not, let's move on. But one of the reasons why this is useful is very often something like this, SLNR, which is defined as a set of all matrices belonging to GLNR, such that det M is 1. Okay. This is a subgroup of GLNR. How do we prove this? We prove this simply by saying if M1, M2 belong to SLNR, that means they both have determinant 1, then first of all M2 inverse of course exists. But anyway, inverses exist for all matrices in GLNR, so that's not a big deal. But M1, M2 inverse will have a determinant which is det M1, det M2 inverse, or det M1 by det M2, that of course is 1. So M1, M2 inverse for any two M2, M1 and M2 belong to SLNR. So that completes the proof that using the theorem that we wrote down on the other side of this page, M1, M2 inverse simply works out to be an element of SLNR. That's straightforward. Yeah. So it's usually not quite true that for all situations you can use this particular theorem. Sometimes using this theorem gets to be more difficult than just checking case by case. But very often if a subset is defined using some defining property, then checking this defining property becomes pretty easy. Similarly, say something like ON. Where ON is simply the n by n orthogonal matrix, or the set of all n by n orthogonal matrices to be more precise. And how do you check whether this is a subgroup? You have to just check that if O1 and O2 belong to ON, that means of course O1 transpose is O1 inverse, O2 transpose is O2 inverse, then O1, O2 inverse, that of a transpose which is also its inverse, that is O2 inverse transpose O1 transpose. That's the standard rule, of course. But O2 inverse is O2 transpose, so this is just O2. This is O2 O1 inverse, which is the inverse of O1 O2 inverse. So this belongs to ON. So orthogonal n by n matrices form a subgroup. You can of course prove all the four basic properties one by one, but this theorem is a quick way of getting there. Similarly, you can show that SON is a subgroup of ON, and so on. So many of these properties are easy to show this way. Now, okay, the other side is unusable. Oh, in case anybody is wondering, those are musical notes and those are not mine. I have no idea what those things mean. I just borrowed some old paper which my son had discarded, so I'm using that. So next comes, so we have covered groups and subgroups. We also need to talk about maps between groups. So you have two groups, G1 and G2, and you will map F from G1 to G2. So a map F from G1 to G2 is called a homomorphism if so of course, as you all realize, the composition rule sitting here between this is the star of G1, and the composition rule sitting here is the composition rule of G2. So the idea is whether you compose them first in G1 and then apply the map, or whether you compose them first apply the map to G1 and G2 respectively, and then compose the result, you end up with the same thing. If this happens, then the map F is called a homomorphism. Now, there is a bit of a controversy about the definition here. Not about this part of the definition, but some people demand that you throw in this. That in addition to being composition preserving, is also surjective or onto. There's a good reason for that. Many proofs that we do will depend on the surjective property of F. So some people say homomorphisms must be defined so that they already have surjectivity built in. Some people say no, homomorphism only needs to be defined with this, which is the more important property, the composition preserving property. And then when you want to use it, you will say if F is a surjective homomorphism, then something goes through. We will take the easy way out. We will use surjectivity as part of definition of homomorphism so that many of the results become easier to state. So this may or may not agree with what you read in your group theory book, because there is frankly two different schools of thought on that. And a special case is so this star 1, this star 2 to be more precise, two different composition rules. So a homomorphism essentially just preserves the composition rule. An isomorphism is an invertible homomorphism or a bijection, to really want to sound sophisticated. The important thing is if two groups G1 and G2 have an isomorphism between them, and the standard languages are called isomorphic in that case, then they essentially are the same group, just with elements relabeled. And this of course becomes a very important tool for various purposes. Okay. Now, with this in this background already, we can state a very important theorem, which is every finite group of order n. I did not define the order, but simply because I had already defined order a couple of years ago. And you all know what order n means, right? It's just the number of elements in the group. Is isomorphic to a subgroup of Sn, where Sn is the okay, this is something which I want one of you to present as a proof in the next class. So the way in which this is going to happen is the overall thing is I will speak for around 1 hour or 1 hour 15 minutes maybe, and then you people will present something. So I need a volunteer who wants to present the proof of Cayley's theorem. If I don't get a volunteer, I will just pick somebody. Okay. So do I have a volunteer in 5 minutes, or do I just get to do eeny, meeny, miny, mo? It's a very straightforward proof. All you need to know is the definition of isomorphism, which we have stated. One thing you will need is something called the rearrangement theorem, which I'm pretty sure all of you already know. But once you know that, yeah, somebody is.
I will present the proof.
Who is the I? You have to name yourself. Ritik. Okay, fine. So you will present the proof the next day. And I hope you will do a better job of setting up the system. So, preferably, okay, I didn't say this at the beginning. I should have said this. What I need from you as a part of the assessment is the notes for these classes have to be properly prepared. Okay, so that is part of your assessment. You team up among yourselves, you decide who will take which part, and every day as the class goes on, you will take part in preparing the notes. Okay, so since Ritvik has already volunteered for the presentation on Cayley's theorem next day, he is exempt from preparing the notes for it this time. Of course, everybody does not have to prepare the notes every day. So you make a roster among yourselves, you decide, and then once the notes are made, you will be judged on the basis of how good the notes are as well. Of course, it will also depend on how good my exposition is, but I'm going to assume that I'm perfect, which I have the right to, being the teacher. So if there are any mistakes in what I say, you have to correct them and then put them in the notes. Is that okay? And if I sort of ramble on and say unnecessary things, you would have to have the full right to curtail those. And the final thing, those notes had better be in a rather decent format, which means it has to be made in what, by the way? What do you people use to write scientific notes? Apart from your hands and pen and paper. You want to write a digital version, what do you use?
LaTeX, sir.
LaTeX, right? Great. It has to be in LaTeX. So if anybody does not know LaTeX in this group, please learn. It's not difficult to learn, and frankly, going out with a physics degree without knowing LaTeX is a crime. So you will have to LaTeX the notes and give it to me. Not immediately, but within, say, a reasonable time, within 7 days or 14 days of the class. Is that fair? 7 days, I think, is fine. You can, of course, pair up and do it in pairs. So that's part of your assessment. So you decide who is going to take which part. But at the end of the semester, there should be a decent amount of notes available, which I can then steal and send to somebody else or use in the next class. Okay? Oh, I will steal them with full acknowledgement from you, but I will also use them for assessment. So be careful about that. Okay. Since nobody is dissenting, I'm assuming that that's what we are going to do. Okay, fine. Next sheet. So now that we know about subgroups and groups, one important notion that we need to keep in mind. Now, of course, let me also hasten to say that this is in no way a complete introduction to group theory. We are only going to look at those aspects of group theory that will be important for our future work, which essentially will mean our work in group representations, because that's what is going to be most important for us in physics. So we will skip over many important results in group theory. We will just note down those that will come in handy later. Sometimes, of course, in this process, I might forget and skip something. And when we later go on and talk about representation theory, we may find that we have not talked about something and then come back and talk about that. A good thing about having digital notes is that you can then edit and put in the extra stuff that I say in the right places. So the next important thing that we have to define are cosets, which is H subset G is a subgroup of G. Then the set where G belongs to capital G, small g is an element, which by definition is G composition with H, so H belonging to capital H. Of course, AG, which is H star G, H belonging to H, and since in general group multiplication is not commutative, it's easy to understand that in general these two sets, G capital H and H capital G, may very well not be equal to each other. Okay, of course, something like EH is always H. So it's not. This is not to say that if the group is non-commutative, GH cannot be HG. All we are saying is it's possible that at least for some G, GH may not be equal to H. Right? This is an exception in the sense that this will always be correct. Also, it's easy to see that if G belongs to capital H, then GH, this set, is simply capital H itself. Right? How would you prove that? So I need an answer from some of you or one of you.
Rearrangement theorem.
Yeah. The point is, one thing can always see that GH has to be a subset of H. That's easy in this case. Because there you are multiplying two elements of H, right? G is an element of H, and whatever you pick from capital H is also an element of H. So when you multiply two elements of H, you're definitely going to get an element of H. So GH is definitely a subset of H. That GH is the same as H, that essentially depends on rearrangement theorem. Or simply speaking, you can never have repeats. That is, H1, H2 and H1, H3 cannot be equal unless H2 equals H3. That is, once I take an element from the group, from the subgroup capital H, and multiply every one of the elements, I will always get distinct results. And since I can exhaust all the elements of capital H that way, these have to be equal to each other. This, of course, is formally correct only for finite groups. For infinite groups, you need to make this a bit more formal, but the basic idea is just this. Okay. So then comes a theorem about cosets, which, by the way, is named after Maschke, M-A-S, if I remember correctly, C-H-K-E. And there are various versions of this theorem which you can find in books. Simply, they are mostly equivalent versions. But the version we will go in for is one of the simplest. And this also works for right courses. So I'll just put this in a bracket here. So, in other words, if I form G1H and G2H, two distinct corsets, then either or G1H intersection G2H is empty. So, if two corsets have even one element in common, they are the same corsets. So, that's rather easy to prove. Well, if they have one, if they're empty, then they're empty, fine. But if they're not, if this intersection is not empty, or if they're disjoint, they're disjoint. But if G1H G2H intersection is not empty, that means there exists some element which is common to both. So, which means there exists H1 and H2 in H, that the G1 H1 is G2 H2, right? That is, this common element which is there in the intersection must be of the form G1 times some element of capital H and G2 times, and that also must be of this form G2 times some element of capital H. Now this immediately proves for you G2 inverse G1 is H2 H1 inverse. Of course, you have to be careful about the sides, whether to multiply something from the left or the right. This belongs to capital H. Now, using that, you can go ahead and show that every element of G1H is in G2H and vice versa. Otherwise, if an element of G1, take an element of G1H, which is of the form G1 some small h. This belongs to G1H, of course. But since G2 inverse G1 belongs to capital H, this also implies G1 inverse G2, which is the inverse of this, has to belong to capital H. So what about G2 small h? G2 small h, which is an element of capital G2 of G2 capital H, has to be, this belongs to capital G2H, but G1 inverse G2, sorry, G1 inverse G2H has to belong to G2H again, because it's just it has to, sorry, this belongs to H, and that means G2H belongs to G1H. I have messed up the simple proof and made it look a lot more complicated than it is, but that's you can easily show that G2H is a subset of G1H, not belongs to, of course, and you can equally easily show that G1H is a subset of G2H just by using the fact that both G2 inverse G1 and G1 inverse G2 belong to capital H. So this is Mashke's theorem, and this immediately leads us to another very important theorem, which just goes, which is easy to prove from this. The order of GH is the same as the order of H, right? Because you form GH by multiplying every element of capital H by a G. So there are at least as many elements as in capital H, I say at least as many because there's a possibility that there may be repeats. Like rearrangement theorem or the fact that cancellation works simply tells you that there cannot be any repeats, right? So what you have is the number of elements in GH has to be the same as number of elements in H. And now since all the courses are either disjoint or completely identical, and every element of the group has to belong to some coset or the other. If to nothing else, it has to belong to its own coset, right? G always belongs to GH. Because H, being a subgroup, has identity in it. So G times identity, that is G, has to be in GH. So every element of the group G belongs to some element, some coset or the other. All the cosets are disjoint or identical, and they all have exactly the same number of elements. So all of this put together simply boils down to this, that at least for finite groups, and this is a statement only for finite groups, the order of H must divide the order of G. This is Lagrange's theorem. So this is all old stuff, right? Nothing new. So you've already seen all this before. And I'm deliberately going through much of this a bit quickly because frankly, there's no point really revising all the old stuff thoroughly again. I hope all of you remember this. If you don't, please refer to your old notes. And then once we have this, some important notions, I'm just going to list them. I hope all of you know what these are. If you don't, then tell me what exactly is the period of an element in a group, what is a cyclic group, what is a cyclic subgroup. I hope all of you know these. I'm not going to even say what these are unless somebody speaks up and says they don't know this. And then the obvious conclusion that prime order must be abelian. I hope everybody remembers how to prove this thing also. All of this is trivial, and it follows from whatever we have said so far. So any questions till now? None. Okay. So let me check what we need to do next. Okay, now comes a notion which again is an old notion. We have discussed this before, but this is going to be very important for what we are going to talk about next. So, and this will recur in various forms throughout when we talk of Lie groups, Lie algebras. The normal group and its result in the algebra form will come in handy more over and over again. Normal subgroups of a group, also called invariant subgroups of a group. So a subgroup in other words, by the way, if this happens, sort of trivial to show. So in general, as we said, left cosets and right cosets can be distinct. But if a subgroup is a normal subgroup, then every left coset has to be the same as the corresponding right coset. Okay, so example. Let's start with a rather non-trivial and important example. So how do you prove this? Well, the result, this proof is really simple. All you have to show is this, that belonging to GLNR, you have this result, and say S belonging to SLNR, you have this result, MS M inverse. This matrix has the determinant, which is easy to see. This determinant has to be determinant of M into determinant of S into determinant of M inverse, and since determinant of S is 1, determinant of M and determinant of M inverse are reciprocals of each other, so you always get 1. So this belongs to, so this implies that S M inverse belongs to SLNR. So what does this really prove? This proves that SLNR, the entire subgroup M inverse, is a set which is a subset of SLNR, right? So that's what we have proven. We have not proven that M SLNR M inverse is SLNR. What we have shown is any matrix which belongs to a set M SLNR M inverse is a matrix which belongs to a set SLNR. In other words, we have not really shown that GN G inverse is N. We have shown GN G inverse is a subset of N. However, I will leave you to worry about this, but this is a very simple result, that for normal subgroups, showing that GN G inverse is a subset of N is enough. Remember, this is true only because GN G inverse is N, or is a subset of N, has been proven, not just for a particular G, but for all G. That's important. Once you can show that GN G inverse is a subset of N for all G, all small g, it's very easy to show that GN G inverse is going to be exactly equal to N. So once again, a proof which I'm not completing, but this is a very, very simple thing to prove. So the important okay. So now we come to a topic which is going to be rather important, and this, although I'm sure we talked about this before, or have I? I don't remember. So quotient groups, we have talked about that, right? In the third year course, did we? Everybody has fallen asleep, right? Okay, is everybody asleep, or am I just...
Sir, I don't remember.
Yes, sir, you did it.
Okay, I did it. Do people remember what that is?
You also did the isomorphism theorems and all those things.
Yeah. We need to do all of that. Okay, Okay, so I did quite a lot, it seems. And obviously, much of it has been forgotten, which is fine. If you don't use it, you will forget it anyway. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about what quotient group really is. Or this is called the quotient group. also known as a factor group. And let me just try to motivate this by going back a bit. Let's first say A and B are two subsets of G. So G is a group, A and B are two subsets, and then we want to define first the product of two subsets. And how you define this is simple. You just take an element from capital A, element from capital B, every such element, and small a belongs to capital A, comma, small b belongs to capital B. So this is a product of two sets. The question is, can we even try to find out some situation where even this product operation among sets will give us a group structure? So we are looking for a new group, not the original group. The original group was where the elements were being composed. Now we are asking, if we take sets of those elements and compose them using this rule, can I hope to get a group structure out of it? For example, if I take two cosets specifically, say if S is a subset of G, which is a subgroup. Unfortunately, as far as I am aware, there is no universal notation for a subgroup. Sometimes some books just use a subset notation to stand for a subgroup. Some books use special notation, but there doesn't seem to be a universal subgroup symbol. But anyway, say S is a subgroup of G, then G1S is a set, right? So is G2S. These are subsets of G, and we can define the product simply this way. Now, the question can be something like this. Now that we have a product defined, G1S times G2S is defined, can we use this to define a group? That is, can we say that, okay, the set of all cosets of the cosets with respect to the subgroup S, under this new multiplication rule, which is a rule for multiplication of cosets, will this give me a subgroup, or will this give me a group definition, new group? Now, one of the first things that you need to check is when you multiply two cosets, do you get a coset? Okay? Now, this is where the problem lies. Notice that the G2 sitting in between S1 and S2 does not have to belong to the coset or belong to the group, subgroup S, right? It's an element of the group G, not necessarily an element of the group S. So what happens is, there is no guarantee that S1, G2, C2, S2 is going to be something in the subgroup S. And so, you cannot in general guarantee that this whole thing, G1, S1, G2, S2, is going to be a coset of a coset with respect to S. In fact, if it is to be a coset with respect to S, it's obvious that it has to be the coset G1, G2S, right? And if it has to be a coset, then this is the only coset it can be. Can you show that? Yeah, this is a question which I'm asking to all of you. Can you show that if it is to be a coset, it has to be the coset G1, G2S and no other coset?
So your audio is breaking up.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. Could you just repeat that again? I moved away while. Yeah. No, what I'm saying is, in general, G1s and in times G2s is not guaranteed to be a coset. But if it is to be a coset, it has to be this coset. Can you see that?
G1 and G2 are the only external elements.
True, but why does it have to be G1, G2s? Why not some other G3s?
If we take S1 and S2 as identity, then G1, G2 belongs to S. So it's
Exactly. That's the point. The point is, one element definitely belongs to G1s, which is small g1. Another element definitely belongs to G2s, which is small g2. Since all we are doing is we are taking elements from G1s, multiplying them with elements from G2s, then G1 times G2 is definitely going to be in this set, right? And if it is to be a coset, then a coset to which G1, G2 belongs is the coset G1, G2s, right? So if it is to be a coset, it has to be this. The trouble is, in general, G1, S1, G2, S2, writing this as G1, G2 times some S3, that's all you really need, right? If you can show that for all S1 and S2, G1, S1, G2, S2 is of the form G1, G2 into some S3 where S3 belongs to S, then you are done. But this will in general not work, right? But when will this work? Notice I can always write G1, G2 as G1, this expression G1, S1, G2, S2 in this form. I can put in a G1, G2 if I want in the beginning, then throw in a G2 inverse, S1, G2, S2, right? This I can always do. All I've done is write G2, G2 inverse is identity and put that in between. But now you can see what has happened. If you look at these three terms, G2 inverse S1, G2, if I can guarantee that it's also in S, then what I have is one element of S into another element of S, right? Now this is exactly the guarantee which is usually missing. If you just start with any arbitrary subset of a group G and take any element G, small g2 from the group G, then G2 inverse capital S G2 is not capital S in general, right? However, when is this always guaranteed?
normal subgroup.
Normal subgroup.
Right. So if S happens to be a normal subgroup, then this element has to be an element of the normal subgroup again. And now you have two elements, not necessarily the same element as S1, of course. One case when this happens trivially is when the group is abelian, right? Because then I could just make G2 jump across and get G1, G2 times S1, S2. No problem at all. But for a general group, this will not happen unless the subgroup happens to be abelian, happens to be normal. If the subgroup happens to be normal, then what happens is this has to belong to, so if I wrote it with this, so if N is a normal subgroup, and thankfully there is a notation for normal subgroup, this triangle with the narrow end pointing towards N is notation for N being a normal subgroup. So if this is true, then G1, N1, G2, N2 is made out of elements of the form G, small g1, small n1, small g2, small n2, belonging where n1, n2 belongs to capital N. And now let's just repeat whatever I said a while ago. This is G1, G2, G2 inverse N1, G2, N2. And now this thing must be N1 prime belonging to capital N. Right? Because that's a defining property of a normal subgroup.
Sir,
And
those
then-
will be N, right? Not N1, N2.
Hmm?
The first
What?
line, those should be N, right? Not N1 and N2.
There should be both N. Right. You're right. There's only one N. G1 N, G2 N. Yeah, right. The small n and small n2 are right, but capital N, of course, there's only one of them. You're not talking about two different normal subgroups. That will be a mess. You're talking about one single normal subgroup. You're perfectly right. So thanks for that. G1n times G2n is this. And then the proof goes through rather simply. You end up with G1, G2 into N1 prime N2. This is something which belongs to capital N. Hence, this belongs to G1. This belongs to G1, G2 capital N. So what have we shown? We have shown that every element in G1 and G2n belongs to I keep on mixing up these notations. Since every element of G1n times G2n belongs to G1, G2n, this set G1n times G2n is a subset of G1, G2n. How do you prove that they are equal? You have to prove simply that every element here belongs to this. Now that part is actually very simple, right? That's how you prove that two sets are equal to each other. You have to show that A is a subset of B and B is a subset of A. Now proving that G1n times G2n is a subset of G1, G2n was the hard part. The easy part is proving the other way around. Why? Because every element of G1, G2n is what? Every element here is of the form G1, G2 times some element small n, right? Of where small n belongs to capital N. Is that right? That's what what is the definition of G1, G2 capital N is. But then this n belongs to G2 capital N. This element, which is G1E, belongs to G1 capital N. So you are done. You have shown that every element belonging to G1, G2 capital N has to be in the set G1n times G2n. So these two have to be equal to each other. Okay, have we proven now that the small gns form a group? The answer is no. We have not proven anything of that kind. All we have proven right now is that we have crossed just the first hurdle. We have managed to show that this multiplication rule that we have used for arbitrary subsets of a group, specifically now for cosets belonging to with respect to the normal subgroup or any normal subgroup, this multiplication at least is closed. You multiply two cosets, you get a coset. And with this particular rule, to show that this is a group, the set of all cosets, the set of all cosets, a normal subgroup, form a group of their own. This is the claim that I am making. Under this particular composition rule for cosets or for sets, subsets. By the way, I did not say left coset or right coset here simply because for normal subgroups it doesn't make a difference. Left cosets and right cosets are the same. But we have just crossed only the first hurdle for this proof. We have proven closure. That is, we have proven that G1n into G2n is a coset, but in particular we have done more than that. We have proven that this is this particular coset, G1, G2 times n. But once we have that, the rest is almost trivial. Associativity. How do you prove this? You want to prove that G1n times G2n, G3n is the same as G1n, G2n, in brackets, times G3n. But that actually is very, very simple. All you do is use this G1n times G2, G3n, right? That's the proof. That is a statement that we proved a while ago. And then this is nothing but G1 times G2, G3n. Again, repeating that result. But that, according to the associativity property in the original group, has to be this. And finally, what we get is this is now G1, G2, N times G3N, and that's G1N, G2N. So your associativity property has been proven. Done. Is it okay with everybody? Okay, since I'm not hearing a dissent, I'm going through. Identity. You need an identity in this particular group. How do you get an identity? Well, the obvious choice would be E times N or N itself. And that's easy to see that G times N times En is GE times N, EG times N. That's of course Gn itself. It's also, from this is also En times Gn. So that's the identity for you. Inverse, again rather trivial. Inverse is Gn's inverse will be simply G inverse N. The proof of that is simply the Gn times G inverse N is G inverse times N, which, by the way, remember, is the identity element of our group. So this group of their own, that the normal the corsets of a normal subgroup form, this is called the quotient group. So why is this called the quotient group? By the way, any idea why the name quotient group is given here? Given to this one, G by N. Of course, you're writing it as G by N, but why you're writing it as G by N for the same reason as why it is called the quotient group.
It is basically related to the Lagrange theorem.
Yep. Just hold on. Abal. Okay, I'm back. Are there any questions about this? The proof? Okay, we did have a question just before I got broken off, which is why is this called the quotient group? Now,
Basically, the number of elements in the quotient group is exactly equal to the
number of elements in G divided by the number of elements in N, right?
yeah.
But that's sort of trivial, right? That's the number of corsets that you have from Lagrange's theorem anyway. Yeah, you're right that all these are true, but there's something deeper behind the name quotient here. By the way, you know that when you identify elements and form a, say, you have done some amount of topology sometime, right? It's a quotienting operation in topology and stuff like that. You have done it ever? Have you ever done that?
Yes, sir, you introduced in your course a bit quotient topology.
Yeah, we talked about the quotient topology, but more importantly, the basic idea behind quotienting is that you identify distinct elements and put them together, right?
Yeah.
And this same thing happens here, because when you say you're identifying an entire coset as an element of your group, what you're really saying is take this big group which has lots of elements, just count all of them as identical if they belong to the same coset, and once you do that, you have got an equivalence relation. This is the critical part. There is an equivalence. Being in a given coset is an equivalence relation. That is something you should be able to prove. And of course, the result that we stated before, that quotients completely part, we did not state in that language, but because being in the same coset is an equivalence relation, and hence the cosets are equivalence classes. So we remember that language. And equivalence classes partition a set. So Lagrange's theorem has two ingredients. One is the cosets partition a set, that is, they are disjoint sets, subsets whose union is the set itself. And the other is that all cosets have the same number of elements. But the first part, the fact that the cosets partition a set, is simply because of this. The quotients are equivalence classes belonging to the same coset. It's an equivalence relation, which is something which you can easily check from the definition of an equivalence relation. And here, this going from the group G to the quotient group G by N really is essentially the operation where you are identifying all the elements of the group of the subgroup N as one element. So basically what you're doing is you're reducing the number of distinct elements that are there in G by saying that elements which belong to the same coset of N will have to be taken together. And once you do that, you have a new group formed out of it. This is the real reason why this is called a quotienting operation. Quotienting here simply means you identify a lot of things together. The same terminology is used for quotient topologies and stuff like that. A consequence of this happens to be that there's this order of the quotient group is the order of G by order of N. Okay. So now, unfortunately, what I have to do is I have to give up my document camera to my wife, who is taking a class in the next room. She has patiently held off her class for some time. So I'm just going to be back, but now we are losing our basic thing. So I will just come back and describe certain stuff, and then we will talk about what to do in the next class. So I am back, and I'm assuming that you can't see me right now. Can you hear me at least? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Once again, I have, yeah, okay, you can hear me. You can't see me, I guess. Let me just see whether I can change the settings a bit. This camera is starting. Okay, you know what I look like, so it doesn't really matter whether you can see me or not. But now we are going blind, so we can't really cover much beyond this. But let me just make some general statements from this point on. Normal subgroups and quotient groups are going to play a huge role in much of the theory that we are going to do later. Let me just clarify once again for those of you who may have missed that ultimately what we are going to do is we are not going to talk a lot about group theory per se. What we are going to talk about more than anything else is group representation theory, because that's what is very important for us in physics. Okay? But we are going to be, whatever I say today and maybe the next day will form basic part of of the tools and stuff that we will need for group representation theory the next day. Okay. Now, two more things before we sign off today. Is the length of this class okay? 2 hours is okay for you? Okay, now perhaps everybody can unmute and we can have a discussion. Although there may be too much noise then, but still. Let me just stop the recording. Okay.